Ciao, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. Welcome back to the Devil's Advocates Debate Club, and welcome especially to the first episode of Defending the Indefensible, a series where I plan to take subjects which the public opinion is overwhelmingly one way, or at least majority one way, and I will fight the other side. As always, the opinions expressed on this channel do not necessarily reflect my own. I'm simply being contrarian. The first episode, I decided to do something current, in defense of Patreon. Now, for any of you who might somehow not know, Patreon is a site where individuals can donate money on a monthly basis to artists that they support on the site. And artists can put up tiers with different rewards or bonuses for people who donate different amounts. You'll usually see a $1 tier and then things above that. Now, Patreon's come under fire because, as most websites, it has a terms of service. And, of course, you're banned for breaking those terms of service. But recently, a man named Carl Benjamin, also known as Sargon of Akkad, was banned apparently without breaking those terms of service. Now, sometimes in the past, companies have updated a terms of service and then rapidly banned a bunch of people. We're seeing it now on Tumblr, but in this case, there was no update to the terms of service before the ban took place. And so people are questioning many things, including legal action, whether or not there was collusion with PayPal due to the Subscribestar incident. A competing company with Patreon, Subscribestar, was banned from using PayPal shortly after Sargon had jumped from Patreon to Subscribestar. So it's been a real interesting series of events for anyone who hasn't been following it. And I'd like to go just a few thoughts in defense of Patreon, because while I have seen one or two people out there expressing doubt that Patreon's really the big evil monster behind all of this, mostly it's been overwhelmingly negative. And I'd like to speak out for them, and specifically for their CEO and founder, Jack Conte, and for the head of their trust and safety department, one Jacqueline Hart. Now, Jack Conte started Patreon after being a musician for several years and a disc artist. He started it so that people could, donate directly to artists like him. It was a good idea, and many people jumped on board. But Jack Conte wasn't a man with a lot of business experience before getting into a venture that probably got a little bit over his head. Jacqueline Hart has worked at different companies before, and has been put in head of Patreon's trust and safety department, coming from more of a business background than the CEO of the company itself. She's likely been put into a difficult situation, whether or not she's handling it well. Now, the place of a trust and safety department in any company is twofold: to make the public feel good about that company, and to get across any of the company's values which it may hold other than profit. A lot of companies are all for profit, but like many others these days, Patreon looks for a little bit more, and takes somewhat of a almost parental interest in the type of people who can be on their platform. I'll start with Jacqueline Hart. Now, I've worked in departments which could have been labeled trust and safety for several different companies. And in the inner workings, sometimes if you're not willing to just quit your job on principle, you're required, if not to outright lie, to bend the truth for the company. And if you're not very, very careful, this can make you sound like a hypocrite. Jacqueline Hart might be an actual hypocrite, but she might just be stuck in between company policy on one side and a non-disclosure agreement on the other. So the real question is Jacqueline Hart a true to her heart Silicon Valley SJW, or is she just your basic run-of-the-mill normie bureaucrat stuck in a difficult situation? And honestly, without getting to know her personally, it's really hard to tell. Now, with Jack Conte, he was a musician who jumped into being CEO of a company larger than he might have expected. And I think he might be experiencing something that I've long suspected of the presidency, which is that when you get to a position of power, and especially if you get to an apex of power, such as leader of a company or country, you find out a lot of things about that role that you just can't know before you get there. And especially coming from a position of Jack Conte's with little business experience into being the CEO of a rather successful company. So, sometimes when I look at the debacle on Patreon, where Jack Conte has come out stating that it would be a bastion of free speech, and then, not a year later, started banning people for what many consider to be questionable reasons. Was he really turning against free speech? Or did he find himself in a position with little to no choice? And, well, much like many people who don't know what they're getting into when they reach a position of power, did what he felt was best. Now, a lot of people talk about collusion with PayPal when it comes to the current Patreon debacle. When Sargon of Akkad was banned from Patreon not only mentioned that payment processors may have been involved in the ban, but as soon as Sargon and several others jumped services to Patreon's chief competitor, Subscribestar, PayPal told Subscribestar to stop using their service. This, in no way, proves collusion, but it does raise some very interesting questions. The first that I asked, and I'm not the only one to do so, is, does this stop with PayPal? Because, of course, PayPal, like so many other businesses, answers to the credit card industries, MasterCard, Visa, and such. Give me just a moment. I know I should learn to edit these videos, but right now I'm working without software on my phone, and I'm afraid I need a drink. Even the devil's lips get parched sometimes. Thanks for bearing with me, gentlemen and ladies. Now, if MasterCard were to be blamed in any way, we would of course need to look for three things. Just like any other crime. Means, motive, and opportunity. Two of these are fairly easy. Means and opportunity, both PayPal and MasterCard have in spades. They can request or likely demand that a company like Patreon or Subscribestar ban anyone from their service without giving them a reason. MasterCard's done it once before with, I believe the gentleman's name was Robert Spencer. And this shows that even while we might not be able to prove motive for Sargon of Akkad or Carl Benjamin, we know that they've had a motive for banning someone in the past. And I question why it would need to be any different for Mr. Benjamin. Now, in that case, Patreon pointed the finger right at MasterCard on social media, on Twitter, I think it was. And MasterCard, well, they received some backlash for that, as most companies do when they ban, any prominent public figure. It's not beyond reason that MasterCard might have signed a new non-disclosure agreement with Patreon, saying that when they request someone banned, Patreon essentially take the blame, or at the very least, don't point the finger. If this were the case, and MasterCard had similar non-disclosures with Patreon and PayPal, maybe even Subscribestar, they could basically have people banned from these services as they felt like it, without anything ever pointing back to them unless there's an official investigation, which currently a lawyer who goes by, I believe, YouTube Law on YouTube is looking into. Now, what he's looking into is collusion between Patreon and PayPal, but I see absolutely no reason it couldn't go a step further. Now, I'm certainly not saying that it couldn't stop at PayPal, but we've seen MasterCard request someone who was accused of being a bigot and a member of the alt-right band before, and Sargon has certainly been accused of these things. Anyway, the next thing I'd like to touch on are Patreon's terms of service. I'm sure you all knew this was coming. And mainly, when are a terms of service too vague? See, most companies worth their merit have a terms of service that allow them to ban people for any reason, basically without asking. The terms of service are there to protect the company, not the user. Patreon, possibly because of the lack of business experience of its founder, had a terms of service that was more like an open contract with both sides. More like what a terms of service, well, kind of should be in some ways. However, this means that when whichever payment processor it was cracked down and asked them to ban someone who had not broken their terms of service, it put them in a very awkward position. See, Patreon can't afford, I don't think, to lose someone like PayPal, and certainly not to piss off a company like MasterCard. They're in a fairly precarious position of still being a fairly small company with a pretty big impression being made on the world. Now, their terms of service are, I'm sure, undergoing lots of changes and will probably be locked tight to defend the company in every way and essentially screw over the users. It's almost essential for them to do so in the position it looks like they've been put in. Here's the question, though. if there was a terms of service violation, is that a legal breach? I've looked into it a little bit, and I'm really not sure one way or the other, but it looks like it wouldn't be. And if PayPal did ask Subscribestar and Patreon to remove Carl Benjamin and possibly others, is this collusion to create a monopoly and remove competition? Or is this simply a company who has a little bit more power in the business hierarchy stepping in and demanding that their values be met ahead of the smaller, younger companies beneath them? Jack Conte believed very strongly in free speech when he wrote his terms of service, and might still to this day, despite the fact that his company has had some speed bumps in that area. And his belief in free speech might be what sinks his company. His willingness to have a more open terms of service with his user base at the beginning of his company's experience may very well lead into legal trouble that will end Patreon. I'm going to get just one more drink here. And then I'd like to touch on just exactly how much support Patreon has lost. Because it's not a number that I've heard calculated, and I don't think there's any way to be sure of the figure yet. However, I'd like to merit a guess. Most of the figures that I've seen, in fact, all of the figures that I've seen from different people on Patreon talking about losing subscribers over this, have said that they've lost, depending on how connected they were to Carl Benjamin and his particular rhetoric, between 10 and 70% of their subscriber base. Now, obviously, the number of people who left Patreon because of this event, which people are still leaving because of, is somewhere between those numbers, I would say. Probably higher than 10%, probably much lower than 70%. The median would be 40%. So it is actually a somewhat conservative estimate, going by that method at least, to say that Patreon has lost at least a third of its user base over banning one person. The question now is, whether it was PayPal or MasterCard, was it worth it to Patreon to ban Carl Benjamin rather than standing up for their terms of service and either changing them before the ban, the sensible option, or standing up for its user to the larger company and working with other payment processors? But who knows? Maybe Stripe has a similar leaning. I actually had an ex-girlfriend who worked for Stripe's equivalent of Trust and Safety for a while, so I know just a little bit about their inner workings. It really is fascinating the way that these payment processing companies deal individually with people. I'm not saying it's bad, it's just really interesting and really different than a lot of other tech companies that I've worked with. Now, I have questioned if Patreon would benefit, or if it would be more fair for the community if bans were voted on. To explain, one of Patreon's major concerns when it comes to creators like Sargon of Akkad, is that they want to build and foster a community which can grow. And they know that having certain people on their platform are going to keep certain other people off. I talked about this in one of my other videos. I think we're seeing a country that is in many ways more divided than we've seen, well, since the civil rights or civil war movements. In some ways, even since then, simply because there are more groups to join now than there were in the old days. More of us to push into those groups. So, what if, rather than banning people on what Patreon has admitted are fairly subjective terms, in order to keep their community clean, so to speak, they let verified users vote on whether or not people are banned. Now, of course, I would want this updated in their terms of service. And, maybe they should even hold a vote on whether or not to do it in the first place. I'd like to see more democracy in my internet websites, I suppose. But I think that for a company trying to do what Patreon is doing, and being a little bit more moral, as opposed to purely using their business sense when it comes to these decisions, it might benefit them to have the community vote on these bans. Because then I think they'd anger a much smaller percentage when somebody is banned over essentially having different social values. Now, Sargon has stated in one of his videos that he considers America to be the greatest country on the planet, and that he stays in Britain to have a chance to improve his own country. He believes that if you think your country is a sinking ship and you jump off, you're just helping that sink ship, or that ship sink, excuse me. And he might be right. Regardless, though, could we apply the same logic to Patreon? So, in other words, should users stay on Patreon rather than leaving en masse? And give them feedback. Give them a chance to change. A lot of Sargon's fans, I've noticed, are complaining that he wasn't given a chance to state his case or to really in any way get his channel back. In some ways, this isn't true, since Patreon has indicated they would accept an apology, and Sargon has said he has nothing to apologize for. But regardless, his fans definitely feel that he was given little to no option about leaving the site and staying off. Is that a reason for them to leave in hordes and to incite other people to do so? By Sargon's own logic, applied to countries, not companies, which are very, very different, you could say that it would be better to stay on Patreon so that they might listen a little bit more closely to what you, a user, has to say. I've rambled on this topic a little more than I had meant to, missed a couple of important points that I'd intended to make, and I'm sharing this with you because as the first episode of this series, I assume that this will be the worst. This is a learning experience for me, and one of the reasons I picked Patreon is because it's been torn apart by lots of other people, so it's pretty easy for me to draw off of well, anyone who might be watching this is knowledge of the situation. But one question I haven't heard asked is Patreon's system of review a good idea? I mean, obviously the way it's been implemented has its issues, but a lot of companies use an algorithm to ban people, basically looking for keywords or phrases or activities and automatically banning users based on that. Patreon, when it's not being leaned on by a payment processor from above, tries to use a more personal review service. This means that bans are a lot slower as they individually review each case and only have a small number of people doing so. Now, if the algorithm had been used and Patreon had it scan Sargon's entire internet profile, it would have found the words that he said which got him banned. Done the exact same thing the Trust and Safety Department is doing, and taken them out of context and banned him. In this case, we have a Trust and Safety team who might have pressure from above and might be looking for any excuse for this ban. But if that weren't the case, if this ban had never happened, would you say that their review process is better than a cold, heartless algorithm? I'm not putting my opinion out there on that one. I just thought that I'd ask, because I'd love to know what everyone thinks.